Welcome to a little bit of London that is forever Jaipur.
Dear friends and lovers of literature, here we are again with JLF at the British Library 2021.
It's a particular pleasure for me to come back to the British Library, which has been my office in London for many years, and where my books have all been written and researched, and it's very nice to see this end of my life sort of double back on it.
Our amazing writers, today more than any time, because of the way the digital age has taken over, we need you to be able to make sense of the past, divine the future, and perhaps set in context what we're going through at this very point of time.
Do you feel that Britain and India can best intersect culturally?
Well, we've been intersecting for a long time. It's not that we will have to intersect. If you look at our cultural and historical relations, we go back a long way.
That may be nations or cultures or religions or sexualities, class, culture, gender, race, all those things, that distance is somehow reduced or bridged because we're connecting at a very basic human level.
I believe in the ability to convey meaning by the written word is our superpower.
Welcome back to the 2021 edition of JLF London at the British Library Virtual Festival. Our next session is Luster, Raven Leilani in conversation with Catharine Morris. The session is presented in partnership with the Swansea University Dylan Thomas Prize and British Council Wales. Raven Leilani's award-winning debut, Luster, has been described as a millennial novel. Written in the first person, it carries the ache of youth and has a brutal and incisive eye for racism and racist violence. The intergenerational narrative follows a young girl's attempts at understanding life while navigating relationships, anger, and her own hidden potential. In conversation today with Catharine Morris, Associate Editor of the Times Literary Supplement, Leilani introduces us to the world of Edie in all her unabashed individuality, sexuality, humour, and rage. Raven Leilani is an American author whose work has been published in Granta, McSweeney's Quarterly Concern, and The Cut, among other publications. While she has written short stories, Luster is her first novel. Catharine Morris is Associate Editor of the Times Literary Supplement, where she commissions and edits book reviews in the field of biography, memoir, travel, bibliography, and language, as well as reviews of journals. All our sessions will be available to view on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. Please do ask questions of our speakers by typing it into the comment section. And if you'd like to help JLF bring more quality content to you in these uncertain times and strengthen the community, please do contribute. Use the link provided. Our podcast partner for this session is Lonchora. Ladies and gentlemen, it's our pleasure to present Luster, Raven Leilani in conversation with Catharine Morris. This session is presented in partnership with the Swansea University Dylan Thomas Prize and the British Council Wales. Over to you, Catharine.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's a huge pleasure to take part and to be welcoming people from all over the world. And I'm so happy to have the chance to talk to Raven Leilani about her brilliant novel, Luster. Luster has won the Kirkus Prize, the Centre for Fiction First Novel Prize, the Dylan Thomas Prize, and the John Leonard Prize for a first book. Leilani was named as one of the National Book Foundation's 5 under 35, and Barack Obama chose Luster as one of his favourite books of 2020. Raven, thank you so much for joining me. I wonder if you'd be happy to describe the book briefly for those who haven't read it.
Of course, and I just wanted to say how good it is to be here. Thank you for having me. It's been the kind of whirlwind of a year. This book, I would say, to describe it in a nutshell, and what's funny is I still, when asked this question, grapple for the right description. But I would say that it is, it's about a young Black woman's journey toward her art. It's about her journey toward seeking intimacy, toward inhabiting the full spectrum of humanity and kind of all that entails, her fury, her anger, her sadness, her joy, and sort of how she manages that up against her environment, which is sort of riddled with these systemic impediments to being fully human, to being soft and open.
Yeah, the program notes mention Edie's unabashed individuality, sexuality, humour and rage, and I thought that captured a lot. And I'm wondering, what came first? Did you think, I'm going to write about rage and sexuality, or did you come up with the character of Edie and then find those things flowing from her? Or was it perhaps
it's funny, like that you say rage, because I do think in the early days when I was drafting, and I wasn't even at the second chapter yet, and I was trying to explain what I was doing, that was actually what I would often land on. I was like, I'm trying to depict as honestly as I can rage, and the way that looks professionally, romantically, the way the sort of sublimation of rage looks like. But it also, I should say, like, when I start, I never really know exactly what I'm doing. I don't really know what I'm doing even after the book is done. Like, I figure out that after the fact and edits. So where I started, honestly, was with one of my most pressing obsessions, which is art. I knew that I wanted to write a story about a Black woman trying to claim that right to make art, and everything else sort of fell into place around her. Writing about art meant writing about her environment and how that intersects with her ability to do that work.
Yeah, it's so striking in the novel how you capture the kind of spectrum of racism from the subtle end to the blatant end, and you realize that actually is linked to her art, isn't it? She struggles to create a self-portrait, and it feels as if that could be linked to the way she's treated in the world at large. Would you say there's a link there?
Absolutely. It's funny because in writing about this, the project of the book is to write about a Black woman who is trying to find the right, find the right space, to find the feeling that she even has the right to kind of inhabit those contradictions, those human contradictions, and to inhabit her rage, to express it. But to express your rage as a Black woman, this is a tricky and extremely dangerous thing. So she's walking a tightrope constantly in her professional and romantic, even in her romantic life, which you would think would be the more freer area. She still feels that need to perform because she isn't sure where it is safe to be, I guess, authentic is the word. And so I absolutely was writing, when I write about her art, that the version that she finds there when she's trying to depict her self-portrait is, it's affected by the performance that she sort of engages in life. She can't really, she's searching for a kind of appropriate approximation of her face, and she can't find it because she's working against a real kind of personal distortion that she has to kind of inhabit in order to survive.
And the interesting thing about that, isn't it, that at the beginning of the novel, she's working in a publishing house and she's one of two Black women in this office, and they take different approaches. Perhaps you'd like to describe the different approaches they take to negotiating that work.
So that was a really tricky but also fun dynamic to kind of put on the page. So she's at work, and I would say as an employee, she's not the best employee, and I wanted to make space for not only the sort of most pristine examples of Black womanhood, but also messy, but also failure. And so at work that exists too. She it works within an environment that sort of requires that tightrope, requires that code switching, requires that she kind of sublimate the real kind of valid fury and feelings of disaffection that she feels about the work that isn't particularly paying her well enough to really live, and where she sees sort of these double standards around her for the people who are like not Black women. They have a different allowance for failure. And so she is aware that there's a tightrope she can walk in order to advance. And then there is another Black woman in the workplace who in a more in a more like ideal world would be her comrade, would be her friend. And they would be able to kind of soldier through together. But the other Black woman in the workplace, her name is Aria, sees that tightrope and takes up that challenge instead of opting out as Edie does. And I think it's not necessarily a binary. It's not necessarily you opt out or you adopt the mask that you need in order to survive. Like there are all of these kind of shades of gray in between, but there's conflict between them because they're two Black women who are ultimately taking just different tacks of survival. Edie's way of surviving is opting out of this mandate that she sort of minimized herself, and Aria's tact of survival is doing what she has to do in order to get her paycheck, in order to get, perhaps to a higher level where she can actually make change from within. And, it's worth saying that who knows if that too is a realistic thing. That we've had a lot of conversations about that. But it was interesting writing those two versions, that sort of opting out of performance and opting in, and how that kind of, can preclude real connection, even if you're kind of coming from the same struggle.
Yeah, so even Edie, who is making an effort almost to be herself in that environment, she still feels inhibited. She's still performing when she meets Eric, who's this married man who's in a marriage, and she meets him, but she's still, there's a misunderstanding, isn't there? He says, you can just be who you are, yes. Be open with me, and that's laughable for her. She can't.
Yes.
But she's attracted by the power imbalance there, almost, would you say? But
yes.
Yeah. So what kind of role does that play, that power imbalance? Why would she want to be with this much older man?
I would say that we've been talking about kind of the the performance that she is sort of engaged in those professional and personal spheres, and that is tethered to those power differentials. One kind of performance is required when you were among a certain level of power, and another is required when you're around another different level of power. And I mean you see that too when we talk about when we talk about like abuse. What we're often talking about is how that behavior is sort of modulated depending on like perceived power of the person. And so her feeling that she cannot like live or be authentic in this arrangement with this older white man who's established is tied to that power, that she feels that he has, even though she has an enormous amount of power herself and kind of has to come to that conclusion, has to kind of make the mistakes in order to come to that conclusion. But that too is a kind of eroticism, is that imbalance, is in its own way exciting to her. And I think that's always what I'm writing toward when I'm writing sex as well, is how to sort of navigate between those drastic power differentials. So for her, there's a kind of aspect of his sort of stature in the world that is alien. He of course, like you said, he doesn't understand her kind of impulse to code switch. But she does because she, being who she is, has to be a student, kind of foremost, has to be a student, and so understands what version of herself is most appropriate and most safe to expose. And so in that way, she is, between them, she knows a lot more because she has to study a lot more. But there is, I think, a comfort that she finds in his sort of relative power, even though he's sort of come to it with more ease.
Would you like to read an extract from the book?
Absolutely. So that the part I want to read it requires just a little bit of a preface. So Edie is an aspiring painter, and she develops a relationship with the man she's seeing. She develops a relationship with his wife, who was a medical examiner. And so Rebecca, the wife, takes Edie to the morgue, and so they can work together. Edie uses the bodies that she sees there as reference, and as Rebecca works as preparing the bodies. So this is where they start. They arrive at the morgue to work. As we take the elevator down to the morgue, I do feel a little stupid about my clothes. When Rebecca offers me a hazmat suit, I'm grateful, but determined to remain impassive. Then she opens her locker and brings out an easel, a blank canvas, a steel palette, 3 paintbrushes, a palette knife, and some yellow, magenta, and cyan. I turn the brush around in my hand and look at the gold lettering on the stem, and she opens the door to the morgue. I look at the paints, which are as beautiful as the brushes, pure, saturated linseed oils. As I'm looking through the supplies, she circles the cadaver and wrings her hands. She already looks like she is tired. Then she puts the radio on and gets her saw. She glances at me a little impatiently, and I realize I, too, am meant to start. I open the easel and set up my canvas. I mix some tertiary colors and make all of them hot. The magenta is such a buttery high pigment that I can bring myself to cool it down. After the initial rush of establishing my palette, I look at the cadaver and my stomach turns. It isn't the body, it's the audience. Rebecca proceeds as if I'm not there, but when I turn to my canvas, I feel her eyes. She tells me to come closer and says to no one in particular, white, male, 87, coronary occlusion. Then she opens the chest and brings out the heart, which is shiny and large and weeping yellow plaque. I do my initial sketch of the body in watered down cyan, and as I go in to fill in the flesh, I find she works a little faster than I can accommodate. One moment the body is whole, and the next it is turned out like a rind. The painting is muddy and full of nerves, but inside there is something exact. And after she showers and we drive home, there is a trail of sequins leading to my room. Next time, I put on a t-shirt and jeans. I bring some graphite and a jar of turpentine. I program the radio with a few of my own presets, and Rebecca doesn't protest. As we enter the Holland Tunnel, the lights on the dashboard flare. She tells me to ignore it, that her truck has been crying wolf for 2 years, but as we pull into the hospital, the engine makes a human sound. We put on our suits and I unpack my supplies. She opens the door, and as I'm mixing the paint, she is collecting the large intestine into a silver pan. I get close and she says, white, male, 89, prostate cancer. I do my best not to think too much about it, but it is hard not to take the point of the surgery scars between the rectum and the bladder. Of course, this is what Rebecca loves about the work, the stories the bodies tell. She believes the best way to see how a thing is made is to take it apart. She says she was a kid who dismantled all of her toys, that it disturbed her mother, but her father understood and started buying her things she could assemble from scratch, clocks and cars and model airplanes. Rebecca smiles at my depiction of a brain that she cuts in half, which from an aerial view looks like a spaceship or a root vegetable. We listen to the radio, and during commercial breaks, she tells me more stories in her terse, non sequitur way. Like this: there was an explosion at the crematorium. Someone forgot to take the pacemaker out. Or this: Da Vinci injected molten wax into the cavities of the brain and put the negative image down in ink. However, I'm not inventing the MRI. I'm grappling with the tendons of the hand. The masters were masters because their anatomical vocabularies were large, because they understood the lateral, posterior, and anterior aspects of the shoulder, which ultimately helped them depict how Jesus might actually hang on the cross. But there is more language within even the respiratory system than I could ever understand. A week later, Rebecca has an obese Vietnam vet with hyperinflated lungs, white, male, 63, asthma attack. And while she is as strong as a woman who regularly heaves post-mortem weight would have to be, she can't move him by herself. I leave my canvas at her instruction and I take the legs, and we move him as one might move a couch up the stairs. Beyond all this, all my joys underneath my palette knife, the folds of the body more pronounced and so more fun to paint, the palette overwhelmingly Caucasian and so a little tedious, though inside the body there is room to experiment with blues and cool dark reds. The cadavers in Rembrandt's paintings were all criminals. The subjects are really the learned men around the corpse. Within my paintings, there's always a half-articulated form of a woman, too mobile to be opaque, craned over the body with forceps in her hand. If she sees herself there, she doesn't mention it. But there are moments when she looks over my shoulder and hums her approval, which of course I resent, but also a little bit love. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that. It's worth mentioning, isn't it, that you have personal experience of two things there. You're a painter yourself, and your mother worked in a morgue. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
So what inspired you to include that experience? And is it right that you actually you saw her working?
Yes. So right, the year before I went to college, my mom worked in the morgue. She was a medical examiner, and she worked at the Veterans Hospital, the VA. And so all the bodies that were coming in, they tended to be older, and they tended to be soldiers. And so I went to go see her work, and I remember feeling really worried that I would be, that I would faint, that it would be too much, and it would be kind of horrific and scary. And it is like, it's awesome in like the kind of biblical sense of the word, like it's full of awe. It's kind of an experience that when she finally opened the door and I went in with her, I was struck by kind of the miracle of the human body. I was struck by how much the body tells you about the life that was lived, and partly because my mom could translate for me. As she was working, she would say, "This is how you can tell that this person smoked. This is how you can tell what their diet was." And actually, I think when I saw her work, it was a very rare thing. She almost never would get women because she worked at the VA, and she had a woman. The body was female when it came in, and it was such an formative experience for me. And at that point, I also had been painting for a while, and I wanted to, at that point, that was really what I wanted to do with my life. And I knew from that study that that was how, the masters and how, in general, how painters, anybody who's working in fine arts, how you study is you have models, you learn from the human form and you study it, and your kind of how good you are, it comes from that love, your willingness to observe deeply. And as I was writing this book, it felt like a great moment to kind of put those two worlds together. So the short answer is that both of those things excited me. Both of those kinds of work excited me, and I wanted to put them together on the page.
And do you still paint? Do you continue to paint?
I do.
Yeah. And do you exhibit your work?
I mean, I don't exhibit it, but it's funny, during the pandemic, because I really hadn't painted meaningfully in a while. I kind of took up, as I started writing more, that kind of became the main thing I did. And that was, all of my energy went there to the page. And then around April 2020, which was a difficult year for all of us, I had a friend who saw the kind of, that I was having a bit of a hard time, and he sent me a package with like 6 canvases, and that was the moment I was like, I'm gonna jump in and start painting again. And it was such a godsend. So I put all that energy there. Suddenly my kind of painting brain was back on, and I painted like crazy during that publishing year. I guess it was also my publishing year. And I put them up, as I painted, I would like put them up. And as we speak, while I haven't exhibited, all of them are gone. I keep them with me, usually here where I'm sitting, but a lot of people, because of the book, have reached out and have taken those paintings off my hands, which is the coolest thing. I love knowing that they're with, people who want them.
How would you describe those paintings? Is there a particular kind of?
I would say they tend to be figurative, because that's what most interests me. Like when I go to museum, that's what I'm drawn to. It doesn't matter what period it is, what kind of style it is. I'm always interested in the body. They're just, I think, an infinite amount of ways to kind of depict that human form. And I think it's probably natural as a human being myself to like be drawn to that form. But yeah, it tends to be figurative, but mostly portraiture, mostly faces. And it's and part of it is because drawing hands is extremely difficult. There's a level at which of painting that I'm not quite there, and the face has always made most sense to me, and so it's the portraits.
One thing I wondered is, how do you feel about your novel being described as a millennial novel? What does that mean to you?
I mean, it makes sense. I am a millennial. I wrote a book about a millennial, although now in hindsight, when I think about her age when I wrote it, she might be like on the cusp. She might be Gen Z. I'm not entirely sure, but I think it would be really disingenuous of me to have written the book I wrote, which absolutely traffics in all of those sort of features of like millennial life. You know, she's working or trying to work within like the gig economy. She's taking gig after gig after gig. I'm trying to sort of tease apart, the kind of ramifications of grind culture. She is a young person who is trying to assert her seriousness in a deeply unstable landscape, both like economically, naturally. You know, she's a person who is at least peripherally aware of the sort of natural disaster that kind of awaits her later years. You know, she is they're all of the things that if you put this is a millennial book and you went down the checklist, my book would absolutely check probably most of those things. And I think part of that is I wrote toward what I knew, and I wrote with the intention of depicting those features of millennial life, which, you know, one of the biggest ones is precarity. How do you make a life? How do you make a life that even looks like the life that perhaps your parents were able to make? What does it look like to think about the question of motherhood, of parenthood in general, when the future is uncertain in the way it's uncertain right now? I think there's a temptation to trivialize that, and it happens every generation. It happens. I'm sure at some point when I'm like an elder millennial, I will have my feelings about the sort of features of like Gen Z. You know, their ideologies. Even though, to be honest with you, I'll say right now, I think they're great. I think they're wonderful. But I do think that every generation has that inclination to distance and distance themselves from what comes after, and to find it alien, and perhaps even to find it trivial. And I wrote this with the, hoping to write with lightness, but also to write toward those features in a way that took them seriously. And I do think that talking about millennial fiction, it's a whole canon of us, and there's so much beautiful art within that canon. I feel like my contemporaries are doing a lot of work, and so when I hear that, it just makes me excited to be a part of that group.
I encountered a lovely quote from Zadie Smith when I was researching this, and she wrote a wonderful piece for Harper's Bazaar, and it began, "I've taught creative writing for almost 20 years now, and in that time some patterns have emerged. For example, the most bombastic young man in the class often turns out to have written the worst novel. Sometimes the most analytic and brilliant readers make curiously rigid and dull writers, and not infrequently the seemingly quiet girl, who speaks rarely but stares at the book in her hand with a strange intensity, is among the best scribblers of the lot. So it was with Raven Leilani." And I just wondered, how did you find that experience of being taught to write? Some people are a little bit skeptical, aren't they, of well, you can't, either you've got it or you haven't type thing. But what would you say there is to learn when you join a course? What do you get out of it, would you say?
Oh, I love that. And hearing you read that, I mean, that it's almost hard to recover after hearing you read that. She was so kind and has been such a supporter of my work. So I feel like I'd be remiss not to mention that, how important she was in sort of me being able to finish this thing. But I would say that I think that for me, I would not have been able to write this book if not for like the really kind of intentional instruction of not just the professors I had, like at the graduate level, or even the undergraduate level. Throughout my life, and I think about it often because occasionally I teach. I don't think I would have arrived at the conclusion that I could do this if I hadn't had teachers every step of the way who validated me or who challenged me and saw that what I was doing and saw how I could do it better. And that could mean like a literal sense of the thing where they see that I've used this word and understand that there's a more precise word that I could use, or they see an entire project and realize that I'm kind of phoning it in and that I could write something that I mean more. But in a more literal sense, at the graduate level, I came in with a totally different book. And it was still actually filled with a lot of my proclivities and obsessions. And so I was writing toward, that thing that I feel like you have to write toward, something you love, because readers can smell when you kind of just, don't care. But it wasn't until I encountered instruction that made me pay attention to how books are put together, like in the most technical sense, that I understood how to write this book. And what I mean by that is, like, it wasn't until I started paying attention to, the writers who came before me, who were doing it well, the deliberate choices they're making on the line level in structure, how that sort of generosity that they kind of have in the text to a reader. It wasn't until I really started looking at that I understood how to put a book together. So I would say that it is, for me personally, like that component has been hugely important in my ability to write.
Yes, I read that you wrote a couple of novels before, and then you wrote Luster, and then something was different. It had an urgency about it. Is that what you mean, that your attention had been drawn to the sentence level and then it really took off?
Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, all of this shows in your writing. I just encourage everyone to read it. Incredible attention paid to every word, and there's so much in there. It's so funny. In fact, did the humour take you by surprise, or did you have has that always been there in your writing? Did it emerge as you went? Is humour important?
What take me by surprise?
The humour.
Oh, well, I absolutely didn't set out to write a book that had this many jokes. I didn't. There were definitely these private things that I needed just to get out. I think any artist who's like making anything has, the thing that they're doing with an kind of eye or like toward the audience, and there are the little parts of within that where it's just for you. It's like just for you. And so there are jokes in here where I've carried them around for ages and put them in the text because I wanted to know that I wanted to put out the kind of flair. Do you feel this too? Do you think that's funny too?
Yeah.
But then, to be honest, most of it, like 90% of probably what I'm seeing is kind of framed as humor, I think kind of just naturally comes from the friction between the hyperbole of Edie's environment and the sort of resignation that she has to have in order to kind of survive it. I think, imbalance is a core kind of, I think, concept of humor. So is surprise. In that way, poetry and humor are very much the same. And so I feel like if you are a writer who is like really, really engaged with the sentence level, and that's another way of saying that you're kind of engaged with the surprise that is baked into the sentence level, then you kind of do end up with humor because you get those really stark juxtapositions in the language, and I think it was just a function of that. But it was so fun to write, and it always makes me happy when a reader reaches out and they said they found humor in it.
Actually, I did make note of something that made me laugh. It's when she's in the publishing company. Early August is generally when employee evaluations start, and I've prepared a diplomatic way to say that I loathe everyone here. I read that you're interested in film and television. Does that affect your writing, the way you write?
I mean, I would say that that too, we were just talking about like the technical components of putting a book together. I think more so in like screenplay, because it's such a distilled form, like you can, but only a very few can really pull it off, like an enormous block of text or prose, you know, in your character's mouth. Like in screenplay, everything is so distilled and everything is also so visual. And so, you know, the language is different, but the intentionality and economy is different. And so I would say that with TV, that economy is something that really excites me, because I do think, as much as I love abundance and I love lush, like big walls of text, what is also, I think, extremely impressive is doing a lot with a little. And I think that that is a medium that does have to do that. And so whenever I'm trapped in my own prose and I can feel that it's like, I need a little bit of restraint, a little bit of more control. I think back to like I think to the screenplay or movies, TV that I really love, and how they do what they do with sort of like the parameters they have.
Sure. We've got some audience questions. Bridget asks, Raven Leilani, in today's digital world, social media platforms have given people some semblance of a structure where they can raise their voices against the institutionalized oppression of marginalized communities. How do you think art and reform movements are intertwined?
I mean, they're 100% intertwined, because I mean, at least the ideal, well, I mean, some art I think should just exist for pleasure. And when I say that, I do want to say that both pleasure and activism can coexist. I don't believe that like some art is broccoli and some is candy, you know, like sometimes they go together. But the function of art, I think you often will hear is to get people free. Like the function of art is to tell the truth. And, you know, when, like, what do dictators do? Like, as they're beginning to kind of accrue power, is they go after the artists, you know, because the artists are like the mouthpieces, you know, ideally for truth. They're our sort of best, one of our best sort of defense mechanisms against the sort of propaganda that is like hugely crucial in any kind of large scale violence. And so I do think that with social media, and like it's a big subject, and so I feel kind of inadequate to kind of address all of the things that it is, because there's good and there's bad, but it does sort of level the playing field in who's allowed to kind of to tell their truth. And in that way, I do think, you know, especially here in America this last summer, our sort of reckoning we had around like police brutality, one of the sort of things that made the difference, because we've kind of had this in the ether for a long time here, but one of the things that made the difference is that we had just an array of kind of these visual representations of like the actual violence that was happening out in the street, and we were able to share them in a different way.
Sure. Emma asks, you've written Edie as a fallible woman, one who's capable of making every mistake in the book. Were you afraid of potential backlash because of writing something that was so relatable and something that everyone went through but denied in order to maintain respectability?
I feel like the most honest answer is that as I was writing, and that is a space that I'm realizing was a real privilege, because it is not always easy to lock into. But as I was writing, I didn't really think about how it would be received. I didn't think about, I didn't think about the sort of judgment that she might, as a deeply fallible Black women might kind of face once the book was out in the world. And in general, I would say that on the whole, everyone has been really receptive to that. And I'm because I'm not the first to do it, like I'm not even the second or third, to kind of lift up a complex Black woman. But I would say, like, it was important to me. It was one of the most important things to me to write a Black woman who got to inhabit all of those complexities and who got to make mistakes. Doing it any other way would have been very much against the sort of ethos of a project where I was trying to, more than anything, to tell the truth, to resist the idea that performance has merit.
Ashley asks, you mentioned wanting to depict professional, personal, and subliminal rage. The concept of the subliminal is a favourite of the new wave of spirituality. Its power of changing reality and determining experiences, if only you believe strongly enough. What is the space of a Black woman's spirituality and idealism in her experiences when confronted by systemic impediments?
I really love that, and partly because I have my own kind of personal journey, like a journey of faith. I was raised extremely religious. I'm no longer, and that path was very, very complicated, and I'm sure will continue as I live. But I do think that I don't think I've actually ever been asked that question, and it absolutely is in the text. You know, Edie does come from a faith tradition, and also has lapsed in her belief, and I do think those two things it's a sort of quandary. For Black people here in America, faith and like organized religion has been both a kind of a means of salvation, a way toward freedom, a way of keeping optimism alive, but it also has been used as a cudgel, as a way to control us, and a way to further marginalize us. And so that's the history. But then maintaining that faith when you are sort of confronted with a environment that you have to, that kind of makes you subhuman, it changes your relationship to faith. It changes the maintenance you do to preserve it, and I do think both tacks are valid. You know, you need faith to survive. You need faith to make reason. But I also see the side of how the direct experience you have as a person who is fighting these sort of structural impediments can make your relationship with faith very strained, and you may decide to opt out.
And Kevin asks, what would you want readers to take away from the character of Edie?
I mean, I would say one of the biggest things I would want readers to take away is that making your way towards your art is often a linear journey. I think like the feeling of, you work steadily toward that thing, and the shape of it has a direct relationship to the work you're doing. I'd say that there's so much failure involved. And that's okay. There are moments in which you think you have to rest, and that's also okay. And also moments in which you have to confront your own self-sabotage and self-doubt. And so the journey there is difficult. It can be. And my main thing was that if it is, that doesn't mean that you are less of an artist. You know, it just means that it takes, that there are kind of hills and that there are valleys. So that is sort of what I would want a reader to take away.
I think we're approaching the end. Perhaps we've reached the end. That's a lovely place to leave it. If that's the case, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.